More than 130 years have passed. Countless theories have emerged, and yet the world still can't answer one burning question: who was Jack the Ripper? Today, we're diving deep into the mystery, the suspects, and the secrets to uncover why this case remains unsolved to this very day. Welcome back, history detectives. Tonight, we take you to the foggy streets of Victorian London, where fear gripped the heart of the city as a shadowy figure committed crimes so brutal they shocked the world. This isn't just another true crime story. It's the tale of the world's greatest unsolved mystery, Jack the Ripper. Imagine stepping back in time to London in the late 1800s. The year is 1888. The air is thick with fog, the streets are narrow, and the glow of gas lamps struggles to cut through the heavy mist that clings to every brick wall. This is Victorian London, a city that is growing rapidly, bustling with life, wealth, and ambition, but also weighed down by poverty, crime, and despair. It's a world of sharp contrasts, where the rich flaunt their fortunes while the poor fight to survive on the fringes of society. Whitechapel, the district where our story unfolds, sits right at the heart of this divide. It's a place bursting with immigrants, factory workers, and families crammed into tiny rooms with no clean water, no sanitation, and very little hope for a better life. The streets are alive with noise, the clatter of horse-drawn carriages, the shouts of market vendors, the rattle of factory machinery in the distance. But beneath all that, there's something else, a feeling. A sense that life here teeters on the edge of danger. At night, Whitechapel transforms. The dim light of the gas lamps casts long, eerie shadows across cobblestone streets. The fog, thick as soup, creeps in from the River Thames, swallowing alleys and doorways in a cold, damp blanket. It's the kind of darkness where you can't see who's behind you, or what might be waiting around the next corner. This was no peaceful neighborhood. Crime ran rampant here. Pickpockets, street gangs, and violent criminals haunted the same alleys where families lived in crumbling tenements. For many, survival meant doing whatever it took to scrape together enough for food and shelter. Women, in particular, bore the brunt of this harsh reality. Many turned to prostitution because it was the only way to earn money in a city that offered them nothing else. These women often worked the streets late into the night, vulnerable, unprotected, and completely at the mercy of anyone who approached them. And yet, in the middle of this chaos, London was also modernizing. The city boasted some of the grandest buildings in the world, from the Houses of Parliament to St. Paul's Cathedral. The British Empire was at its peak, controlling territories across the globe. For the wealthy elite, life was dazzling theaters, banquets, and carriages lined with velvet. But in places like Whitechapel, that wealth was nothing more than a distant rumor. Here, disease spread quickly, hunger gnawed at families, and violence was never far away. It's hard to imagine a better hunting ground for a killer. The layout of Whitechapel itself was like a maze, a network of narrow alleys, dead ends, and hidden courtyards where someone could vanish in seconds. Police patrols were limited, and even if an officer did hear a scream, by the time he arrived, the killer could easily melt into the shadows. The people living here weren't strangers to death or crime. Murders happened in London all the time. But nothing prepared them for what was about to descend on their streets in the autumn of 1888. A killer with a taste for terror was about to emerge, one who would send fear rippling through every home, every pub, and every alleyway in Whitechapel. And the strangest part? He didn't just kill, he mutilated. He left behind scenes so horrific that even hardened police officers were shaken. But before we get to him, you need to picture the world he moved through. Imagine the smell of coal smoke mixed with sewage and rotting garbage in the gutters. Imagine the cold wind whipping through your thin coat as you hurry home before dark. Imagine hearing footsteps behind you in the fog, but not daring to turn around. This was the London of Jack the Ripper, a city of two faces. On one side, a glittering empire. On the other, a neighborhood where the shadows grew thick. The nights were long and evil could walk freely without a name or a face. Now that we've stepped into the streets of Victorian London and felt the weight of the fog, the fear, and the poverty pressing in from every side, it's time to talk about what truly sent shivers through the spine of the city. The crimes themselves. The killings that turned ordinary fear into outright terror and gave the shadowy figure stalking the streets of Whitechapel a name the world would never forget: Jack the Ripper. It all began in the early hours of August 31st, 1888. Mary Ann Nichols, known to her friends as Polly, was found lying in the darkness of Bucks Row. At first glance, it seemed like yet another tragedy in a neighborhood all too familiar with violence. But as police lanterns flickered over the scene, they realized this was different. Her throat had been cut with horrifying precision. And worse, her body had been mutilated in ways so gruesome that even seasoned detectives were shaken. This was no robbery gone wrong, no drunken street fight. This was something colder, something calculated. Just a week later, on September 8th, Annie Chapman was discovered in Hanbury Street, her body displaying the same brutal signature. Again, the throat slashed, the body desecrated with shocking savagery, and now the whispers began. People in the pubs, in the crowded tenements, in the bustling markets. Everyone was talking about the killer who seemed to strike without warning, slipping into the night like a phantom. The fear grew thicker with each passing day. Women refused to walk alone. Men eyed strangers with suspicion. The police, desperate for leads, increased patrols, but it didn't matter. Because then came the night of September 30th, a night burned into London's memory as the double event. In the early hours, Elizabeth Stride was found in Dutfield's yard. She had been killed, her throat slashed, but curiously, her body wasn't mutilated like the others. Some believed the Ripper had been interrupted, scared off before finishing his terrible work. But just 45 minutes later, Catherine Eddowes was discovered in Mitre Square. And this time, the killer unleashed his full fury. Her injuries were worse than anything seen before. The Ripper hadn't just killed her, he had taken his time. London was in full panic now. Newspapers exploded with lurid headlines. Letters began arriving at police stations, claiming to be from the killer himself. One infamous note, signed Jack the Ripper, would forever cement his name in history. Was it really him? No one knew. But the fear it generated was very real. And then, on November 9th, the murders reached their horrifying peak. Mary Jane Kelly, the final canonical victim, was found in her small rented room on Dorset Street. What police saw inside was so horrific, so unspeakable, that many officers refused to talk about it afterward. Her body had been mutilated beyond recognition. It was as if the killer, safe behind the closed door of her room, had unleashed every dark impulse he possessed. By now, London was paralyzed with terror. Women no longer walked the streets after dark. Men formed neighborhood watch groups, determined to catch the killer themselves. The police were under immense pressure, but every clue seemed to lead nowhere. What made the crimes even more chilling was the precision. The killer seemed to have knowledge of human anatomy. Some suggested he was a doctor or a butcher, someone with skill and confidence in wielding a knife. Others thought he was a madman, driven by forces no one could understand. The victims themselves were all women struggling to survive in one of the toughest parts of London. They were poor, vulnerable, living on the edge of society. Many were sex workers, making them easy targets for someone who knew the streets and the shadows. It was as if the killer deliberately chose victims no one would protect. Women the police and the public often overlooked, until their deaths forced the city to pay attention. The brutality of these murders was unlike anything London had ever seen. Each killing seemed to mock the authorities, as if the Ripper were taunting them, daring them to catch him while he continued his reign of terror. The newspapers fed the frenzy, printing every grisly detail, every wild theory, every supposed clue. Jack the Ripper wasn't just killing women. He was holding an entire city hostage with fear. And yet, despite the chaos, despite the extra patrols, despite the growing public outcry, the killer moved like a ghost through the alleys and fog. No one saw him clearly. No one heard him approach. He struck quickly, silently, and then vanished before anyone could react. It was as though the night itself was his accomplice, hiding him in its dark folds while the rest of London held its breath, waiting for the next scream to shatter the silence. The moment the first body of Mary Ann Nichols was discovered in the early hours of August 31st, 1888, Whitechapel was no longer just another rough neighborhood in London. It became the center of one of the most intense manhunts the city had ever seen. Police officers flooded the streets, detectives interviewed witnesses, and newspapers screamed headlines about a killer on the loose. But as each day passed and each new victim was found, it became painfully clear that the killer everyone would come to know as Jack the Ripper was always several steps ahead. The Metropolitan Police were under enormous pressure right from the start. The first murders shocked the community, but as the killings continued and the brutality escalated, outrage turned into panic. Crowds gathered at crime scenes, angry mobs demanded answers, and the press stoked the fire with sensational stories. Every detective in London wanted to catch the Ripper, but there was one huge problem. 1888 was an age before modern crime-solving tools existed. Fingerprinting, it wasn't in use yet. DNA testing, that wouldn't come for another century. CCTV cameras, forensic psychology, digital databases, none of it existed. Detectives had only their wits, eyewitness accounts, and whatever physical evidence they could see with the naked eye. And Jack the Ripper, whoever he was, seemed to know exactly how to exploit that. Police reports from the time show they were overwhelmed with tips and leads, most of them going nowhere. Witnesses claimed to have seen suspicious men lurking in the alleys, but their descriptions rarely matched. Some swore the killer was a man in a long dark coat. Others said he wore a hat pulled low over his eyes. A few even suggested he was a foreigner, feeding into the xenophobia that already ran through London's poor districts. But when detectives followed up, the trail always went cold. The streets themselves didn't help. Whitechapel was a maze of narrow passageways, hidden courtyards, and dark corners. At night, with only dim gas lamps casting weak pools of light, it was the perfect place for someone to commit a crime and disappear before anyone even knew what had happened. By the time the police arrived at each murder scene, the killer was long gone. And then there were the letters. Oh, the letters. Dozens of them arrived at police stations and newspapers, claiming to be from the killer himself. Some were clearly hoaxes, written by pranksters hoping to stir up chaos, but a few stood out. The most famous was the Dear Boss letter, where the writer mockingly signed off as Jack the Ripper, a name that would soon dominate headlines around the world. Another letter, known as the From Hell letter, came with half a human kidney preserved in alcohol. The writer claimed it belonged to one of the victims. Whether these were truly from the Ripper or just sick jokes, no one could say for sure. Scotland Yard brought in some of their top detectives, including Inspector Frederick Aberline, a man who knew the streets of Whitechapel well. He chased down every lead, interrogated countless suspects, and coordinated teams of officers to patrol the streets at night. But no matter how hard they tried, the killer seemed to vanish into thin air after each murder. It was as if he were watching the police, learning their methods, staying just out of reach. Some officers believed the killer might be a local man who blended in perfectly with the community. Others thought he could be someone educated, maybe even wealthy, coming into Whitechapel from outside and then disappearing back into respectability before dawn. The theories multiplied, but the evidence never pointed clearly in one direction. The newspapers made everything worse. With each killing, reporters rushed to the scene, interviewing locals, exaggerating details, and publishing sensational stories that sold papers by the thousands. Some journalists even criticized the police directly, accusing them of incompetence, corruption, or simply not caring enough about the lives of poor women in Whitechapel. Public confidence in the investigation sank lower with every unsolved murder. The truth was, the police were trying almost everything they could think of. They offered rewards for information. They brought in bloodhounds to track the killer's scent, though the plan failed before it even properly began. They even had undercover officers dressing as women, hoping to lure the Ripper into striking again so they could catch him in the act. Nothing worked. And so the murders continued, each one bolder and more gruesome than the last, until fear gripped every corner of London. By the time Mary Jane Kelly's body was discovered in November, the police were desperate. They had interviewed hundreds of people, arrested dozens, and yet they were no closer to finding their man than on the night of the first killing. The failure of the investigation would haunt Scotland Yard for decades. It exposed the limits of Victorian-era detective work, where evidence disappeared quickly Crime scenes were trampled by curious onlookers, and killers could literally walk away into the fog without leaving a single clue behind. It was a battle fought with lanterns and notebooks against a man who seemed to melt into the darkness itself. As the Autumn of Terror unfolded and the bodies in Whitechapel continued to mount, London became a city obsessed with one question: who was Jack the Ripper? The killings were horrifying enough on their own, but the fact that the murderer walked freely through the same streets as everyone else, perhaps even blending in with the curious crowds at his own crime scenes, sent shivers down the spine of an entire city. And so, theories began to swirl like the fog around Whitechapel's gas lamps, each one trying to unmask the man behind the knife. The police, the press, and the public all had their own ideas. Some suspected a foreigner, someone from outside the community. This theory gained traction partly because of the xenophobia that simmered in the East End. Immigrants had flooded into London in the years before the murders, especially Jewish refugees fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe. Many locals viewed them with suspicion, and when the Ripper killings began, it didn't take long for ugly rumors to spread that the killer might be one of them, a stranger in their midst bringing violence with him. One name tied to this fear was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant who worked as a barber. Years later, his name would resurface in modern investigations when DNA evidence pointed in his direction. But at the time, police couldn't prove anything, and the murders didn't stop. Others believed the Ripper was a man of education, someone with medical or anatomical knowledge. After all, the mutilations showed precision, a steady hand, a familiarity with the human body. This theory gave rise to one of the most infamous suspects of all, Montague John Druitt, a barrister and schoolteacher who drowned in the Thames shortly after the last canonical murder. Some thought his suicide was a sign of guilt, that perhaps the killer, feeling the pressure closing in, chose death rather than capture. But again, there was no solid proof linking him to the crimes. Then came the even wilder theories, the ones that gave the story of Jack the Ripper its air of Gothic mystery. Some whispered about a royal conspiracy, claiming the killer was actually Prince Albert Victor, grandson of Queen Victoria, or someone acting on his behalf to cover up a scandal involving the royal family. According to this theory, the victims knew too much, and the murders were part of a grand plot to silence them forever. It made for sensational newspaper headlines and thrilling late-night conversations in pubs. But historians today largely dismiss it as fantasy born out of a desperate need to explain the inexplicable. Another suspect was a man named Michael Ostrog, a Russian doctor and criminal with a history of violence. His name appeared in police records, but again, nothing connected him directly to the killings. There was also Thomas Cutbush, a medical student rumored to have a violent temper, and Francis Tumblety, a quack doctor from America with a hatred for women. Each time a new suspect emerged, the press exploded with excitement, convinced the mystery was finally over. But just as quickly, each lead collapsed under scrutiny, leaving the Ripper as faceless as ever. One of the strangest aspects of the case was how the killer seemed to vanish after November 1888. Some believed he was arrested for another crime, or died, or simply left London, taking his secrets with him. Others suggested he was never one person at all, that the Ripper was a name attached to multiple killers working independently, their crimes blending together in the chaos of Victorian Whitechapel. There were even psychological theories, decades ahead of their time, proposing the Ripper was a man with deep-seated hatred for women, possibly stemming from a troubled childhood or a mental illness that drove him to kill. But in 1888, criminal profiling was in its infancy, and the idea of understanding a murderer's mind rather than just his actions was still considered radical. The newspapers, always hungry for scandal, played a huge role in shaping these theories. Every time the police released a detail, no matter how small, the press magnified it into something sensational. A single clue could birth a dozen suspects overnight. Witness statements, many of them unreliable, became gospel in print. And as the public devoured each new headline, the legend of Jack the Ripper grew larger, stranger, and darker than the real man could ever have been. Even some of the police themselves disagreed about who the killer was. Inspector Frederick Aberline, the man leading much of the investigation, reportedly believed George Chapman, a Polish-born serial poisoner caught years later, might have been the Ripper. Others within Scotland Yard favored different names, pointing fingers in all directions as frustration mounted. The truth was, Victorian London had never seen a killer like this before. Murders happened all the time, yes, but not like this, not with this level of brutality, this public taunting, this ability to disappear into the night without leaving so much as a footprint behind. Each theory, each suspect, each headline was a city's attempt to impose order on chaos, to name the faceless shadow haunting its streets. Because as long as Jack the Ripper remained unidentified, the fear never really went away. More than a century has passed since the Autumn of Terror in 1888, yet the name Jack the Ripper still echoes through history like a whisper in the dark. But the question everyone keeps asking is this: why, after all these years, does this case remain unsolved? Why does the killer who stalked Whitechapel's foggy streets continue to hide behind the veil of mystery, while so many other historical crimes have been solved? The truth lies in a perfect storm of circumstances, a mix of timing, technology, mistakes, and chaos that left the case frozen in time, a puzzle with too many missing pieces to ever complete. One of the biggest reasons the Ripper case remains unsolved is the sheer lack of evidence. In 1888, forensic science was practically non-existent. Today, a single hair, a drop of blood, even the faintest fingerprint can crack a case wide open. But back then, detectives had none of those tools. Crime scenes weren't preserved. Curious onlookers, reporters, and even police officers trampled through them, contaminating everything before investigators had a chance to piece together what happened. The victims' bodies were often moved quickly, sometimes even before photographs could be taken, and valuable clues were lost forever in those first chaotic hours. Then there was the setting itself. Whitechapel wasn't a quiet village where a stranger would stand out. It was a crowded, noisy labyrinth of streets, alleys, and tenements packed with thousands of people coming and going at all hours. A man could slip into the darkness after committing a murder and be swallowed by the night before anyone realized what had happened. Witnesses claimed they saw men with the victims shortly before the murders, but their descriptions were vague, sometimes contradictory, and often confused by fear or the haze of alcohol. The police were left chasing shadows through a neighborhood already crawling with crime and poverty. Another problem was the sheer volume of false leads and hoaxes. Hundreds of letters poured into police stations and newspapers claiming to be from the killer, many of them obvious fakes, but each one had to be investigated. The most infamous, the Dear Boss letter and the From Hell letter, only added to the chaos. Was the Ripper really taunting the authorities, or were pranksters feeding the frenzy for their own amusement? The police never knew for sure, and the distractions pulled attention away from real clues that might have led somewhere. The investigation itself also suffered from the limitations of Victorian policing. Detectives lacked modern coordination methods. Information was scattered across different stations, sometimes poorly shared or lost altogether. Rivalries between officials didn't help either. Scotland Yard handled most of the case, but the City of London police controlled some of the territory where the murders occurred, leading to conflicts and confusion about jurisdiction. Instead of one united front against the killer, the investigation sometimes felt like two separate forces chasing the same ghost from opposite ends. On top of that, the pressure from the public and the newspapers was relentless. Every time another murder happened, headlines screamed about police incompetence, accusing them of failing to protect the women of Whitechapel. Detectives were hounded by reporters, criticized by politicians, and watched by an angry population demanding answers. The killer seemed to sense this pressure, striking again and again as if mocking the men tasked with catching him. Each failure chipped away at the police's credibility, and as frustration mounted, so did the mistakes. Then there's the fact that Jack the Ripper simply stopped. Serial killers today are often caught because they keep killing until they slip up or leave behind evidence that ties them to the crime. But after Mary Jane Kelly's murder in November 1880, the trail went cold. No more bodies appeared bearing the same horrific signature. Some believe the Ripper was arrested for another crime, locked away where he could no longer kill. Others think he died, perhaps by suicide, taking his secrets to the grave. Another theory suggests he left London altogether, disappearing into another country where no one knew his name. Whatever the reason, his sudden silence robbed investigators of the chance to catch him in the act. And finally, the passage of time itself sealed the case in mystery. As years turned into decades, evidence degraded, files were lost, and witnesses passed away. By the time criminal profiling, DNA testing, and modern investigative techniques came along, the Ripper case was already a century old. The world had changed, but the killer's identity was buried beneath layers of missing documents, contaminated evidence, and long-forgotten testimony. Even today, with technology capable of solving cold cases once thought impossible, the Jack the Ripper mystery refuses to yield a definitive answer. DNA tests on old evidence have produced names, but none beyond dispute. Historians, criminologists, and amateur sleuths still debate the same suspects that baffled detectives in 1888. The fog that covered Whitechapel on those terrifying nights has never really lifted from the case itself, leaving us with questions that seem destined to remain unanswered more than a century after the Autumn of Terror. The name Jack the Ripper still sends a shiver down the spine. You would think that with all the advancements in science, technology, and criminal investigation, the mystery would have been solved by now. After all, modern detectives have tools the Victorian police could only dream about: DNA profiling, criminal psychology, digital databases, geographic profiling, even artificial intelligence analyzing old evidence. And yet the killer remains as faceless as ever. Each time the world comes close to naming him, the answers slip through our fingers like the London fog that once cloaked his crimes. Over the years, countless investigators, both professional and amateur, have tried to crack the case using modern methods. The idea of re-examining century-old evidence with 21st century science is irresistible. Old letters supposedly written by the Ripper have been tested for DNA, though contamination over the decades makes results uncertain. In 2014, one piece of evidence, a shawl believed to belong to Catherine Eddowes, one of the victims, made headlines when researchers claimed to have found DNA linking it to a suspect named Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant living in Whitechapel at the time. The announcement caused a sensation, with newspapers around the world proclaiming the mystery solved at last. But almost immediately, doubts surfaced. Critics questioned whether the shawl even belonged to Eddowes. Others pointed out that the DNA analysis itself had problems, with experts disagreeing on whether the genetic evidence was conclusive at all. In the end, the claim failed to settle the debate. Kosminski remains one of the strongest suspects, but no definitive proof has ever emerged tying him to the crimes beyond dispute. And he's far from the only one. Over the years, modern researchers have examined the lives of dozens of men who lived in London during 1888. From royal family members to local butchers, from failed medical students to traveling salesmen, each has had his moment in the spotlight as the possible face behind the knife. Criminal profilers have studied the Ripper's crimes, creating psychological portraits that suggest he was an organized killer with deep-seated hatred for women, perhaps someone who blended into society so well that no one ever suspected him. Others argue he might have been a transient, someone passing through Whitechapel, explaining why the murder suddenly stopped. Yet, even with behavioral science on our side, the identity of the man behind the legend remains locked away in the shadows of history. What's fascinating is how Jack the Ripper has become bigger than the crimes themselves. He's no longer just a murderer from the 19th century. He's a cultural phenomenon, a name recognized all over the world. Books, movies, documentaries, and even video games have kept his story alive, each retelling shaping him into a figure of almost mythic proportions. Some portray him as a madman, others as a criminal mastermind, and still others as the central figure in elaborate conspiracies involving the police, the royal family, or secret societies. The lack of answers has turned Jack the Ripper into a blank canvas onto which every generation paints its own fears and fascinations. In a way, that might be why the mystery endures. Solving the case would strip away the layers of legend and speculation, turning the Ripper from a shadowy figure of horror into just another criminal with a name and a face. The mystery gives him power. It keeps people talking, keeps researchers digging, keeps authors and filmmakers returning to those gaslit streets of Whitechapel to imagine what really happened. And it's not just about Jack the Ripper himself. His crimes changed the way society thought about murder, policing, and the press. The media frenzy surrounding the killings was unlike anything the Victorian world had seen before. Sensational headlines, graphic illustrations, and wild theories sold newspapers by the thousands, turning the case into one of the first global media events. Even today, true crime reporting owes something to the template set by the Ripper coverage, where public fear and curiosity fed on each other in a never-ending cycle. The case also exposed the flaws in Victorian policing, leading to changes in how investigations were handled in the years that followed. Better record-keeping, improved communication between departments, and eventually the adoption of forensic techniques all grew partly out of lessons learned from the failure to catch the Ripper. In that sense, his shadow shaped the future of law enforcement itself. But the biggest legacy of all might be the mystery. Jack the Ripper remains the ultimate cold case, the standard by which all unsolved crimes are measured. Every time new evidence is claimed, every time a new book promises the final answer, the world stops and listens, hoping for closure that never comes. And maybe, deep down, we don't really want the mystery solved. Because as long as Jack the Ripper's identity remains unknown, the story continues to haunt us, drawing us back to those foggy streets of Whitechapel again and again, making us wonder who he was, why he killed, and how he managed to vanish so completely that more than a century of investigation has still failed to drag his name into the light. And so, after exploring the dark streets of Victorian London, the terrifying murders, the desperate police investigation, the endless theories and suspects, the reasons the case remains unsolved, and even the modern attempts to uncover the truth, one thing becomes clear: Jack the Ripper is more than just a name from history. He is a mystery that refuses to die. For over a century, the world has searched for answers, hoping to put a face to the shadow that haunted Whitechapel in 1888. But the killer slipped through the cracks of time, leaving behind only fear, speculation, and legend. Perhaps that is why the story continues to captivate us. Because Jack the Ripper represents the ultimate unanswered question, a puzzle that has outlived the victims, the witnesses, and even the investigators themselves. And until the day someone finally solves it, if that day ever comes, the Ripper will remain what he has always been: the world's greatest unsolved mystery.